Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in our ongoing series. I'm Snigdha Roy, Subject Coordinator for History, and today we shall cover curriculum and teaching methodology in the subject. Taking the lead today would be Gavin D'Souza from the Middle School History team. He'll join us in a minute. Um, I just want to pick up from where we left off in the last webinar. While we were discussing the nature of the subject, we introduced you to these key historical concepts: uh, cause and consequence, significance, perspective, similarity, differences, change, and continuity. We had also discussed this timeline where you would see the subject progression according to each grade. So here you would see that in the middle school years, we cover the timeline between the 3rd century to the 19th centuries of the Common Era. Now, alongside this curriculum timeline, which is to your left, I want to juxtapose these topics with the key skills that they develop year by year in their middle school years. So, to the right, you will see that in grade 6, our teaching strategies focus on selecting, recalling, and deploying historical information. This is the year in which students come to terms with historical concepts and their significance. They are learning to use terminologies to communicate their ideas, whether it is in the written format or in the form of a class discussion. In grade 7, students independently interpret primary and secondary sources, and by the end of grade 8, they are confident in using these sources to develop their own logical arguments. Now, time and again, we have reiterated that history at NIS is not a memory based subject, but a skill based subject. And over the course of our presentation today, you will see how these skills are developed in interactive ways to generate curiosity, enthusiasm, and passion for the subject. This objective is to calibrate the spirit of inquiry, which is a skill that is necessary for all areas of study, including higher education. Now, with this context in place, Gavin will walk you through a teaching methodology for grades 6 and 7. Over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Snigdha. History has, for the longest time, been a fascinating aspect of humanity. If we do not know where we come from, how would we know where we are going? These questions and more make us ponder upon what it is to be human, what makes us who we are, and what will happen to us in the years to come. And while it may not be precise, we can predict these outcomes on the basis of what has transpired. After all, history repeats itself. I am Gavin D'Souza, and today I am here to take you through the historic middle school journey middle schoolers go through. For starters, let me begin with a simple question. What is your memory of learning history in school? Let me guess. Memorizing dates and events? Boring history classes where the teacher made you read dry paragraphs from the textbook? Long answers deceptively titled brief answers? And if you were on the mischievous side, then a moustache or two drawn on the colorless faces of Rajaram Mohan Roy or Lal Bahadur Shastri simply because you wanted something to pass your time. At NIS, history is done differently. And over the course of the next few minutes, we will see how. In this webinar, we shall discuss processes which we employ to teach history and to look at the human side of history. We strongly believe that humans create history, and ever since consciousness crept in, most humans still function on the same driving forces even today. When you visit a place without asking GPS for help, the thrill you feel is the same that Vasco da Gama felt. The feeling of victory you feel when you close that deal is the same feeling Bonaparte had on winning Waterloo. The dread people felt at the onset of the Black Plague, similar to what you felt at the start of COVID-19. Thrill, success, dread are all feelings humans felt then and humans feel now as well. Using this commonality between then and now, we approach history in our middle school. Grade 6, India and Medieval Europe. The fascinating bit about younger minds is that they will be extremely curious about all things under the big blue sky. As a facilitator catering to the curiosities of these inquisitive minds, we don't just focus on offering them content that will streamline their thinking. We give them situations and scenarios where they can think for themselves. They get to be in the driver's seat and satiate their curiosities on their own. At the grade 6 level, we focus on basic skills like significance of historic events, similarity and difference, change. Cholas and the Guptas. While having a discussion about empires and rulers can be a passive experience for students, if we expect them to visualize the content available. In order to make matters immersive, we allow them to be a part of the process by offering innovative practices. On the left, you see examples of the article that students read for better understanding on Nalanda. This was while we were discussing education during the Gupta period. On the left of the same slide, I'm so sorry, on the right of the same slide, what you see is an example of Ruler for a Day, which was one such activity that allows students to be a part of the decision making process by designing coins for them. What you see in these slides is an example of what happens in a day to day basis in our classrooms. They are given questions like, if you were a ruler for a day, what policies would you implement? What currency would you introduce? And what value would it be? What would your flag look like and why? In this slide, you can see an you can see yet another example of another article to explain the trade relationships during the Chola period. This is an example of a secondary source. History is all about drawing parallels between days that once were and now. While we find ourselves to be in the midst of a pandemic, we know for a fact that this hasn't happened for the first time. And what better aspect of pandemic can students analyze than the Black Plague? The Black Plague, for the most part, is an indelible part of history that historians have written about for ages. Interesting articles, trivia, and diary entries, like the one you can see on the screen, seem to have are written by people who have experienced the Black Plague firsthand, and these resources are offered to students to analyze and form their own perspectives. Here you can see a diary entry of Boccaccio, a celebrated painter and diarist who described the plague in his own words. Through these activities, students learn one key skill of analyzing primary sources by actively going through them. Students also understand how citations work and how it can be crucial to making claims, whatever those may be. With this, we are aiming to create a generation of individual thinkers who are not only curious about things but also know how to satiate their curiosities. We are aiming to create mythbusters and fact checkers. Coming to grade 7 now, at the grade 7 level, we aim towards developing skill sets among our students like analysis of significance, cause and effect, drawing meaningful parallels between then and now. India in the 12th century, we discussed Ghazni, Ghori, and the Delhi Sultanate. When it comes to making decisions, or when it comes to making students think about situations from a different perspective, nudging them with certain prompts becomes essential. Giving them free rein to think on their own allows them to think out of the box. Classroom strategies like what would Razia do makes them think of situations from the perspective of the historic personality, and it also prompts them to assess if they would do things any differently had they been in those situations. Having an audio visual experience enables students to relive a time that they never really saw. Videos from beloved sources like Amar Chitrakatha, History Channel, etc. aid their imagination and makes them wonder what if situations better. Classroom discussions and debates on topics like was it fair for Iltutmish to hand over Sultanate to his daughter sparks interesting conversations and enables students to stumble on the ideas of feminism by themselves instead of others having to explain it to them. This interactive approach leads to lifelong retention, and it makes them adept at understanding concepts on their own instead of the facilitator telling them what it is. From comic strips to classroom debates, we ensure that our students have all the avenues that, that are needed to express themselves and their point of views. History is not just a subject, it is a tool for identity building. Here you see some comic strips and drawings made by students during these classroom activities. Here on this slide, we see some more articles that were offered to students to understand India in the 12th century. And classroom discussions were conducted on the insights gained from these articles and more. Now, coming to the next topic, Renaissance, the birth or the rebirth of Europe. The Renaissance was a time of innovation and creative liberty. Humans looked at the world in a different light post the carnage of death caused by the Black Plague and the Crusades. In the era of rebirth, artists, thinkers, philosophers added new light to concepts well known to humankind and came up with their ideas and beliefs and perspectives that still enthrall us. People like Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo, and many more. Here you see some examples of videos that were shared with the students about the past, the present, and the future of the bubonic plague. Also, why the Mona Lisa is so famous when Leonardo is known to have made better paintings. With the Renaissance, we delve deeper into the world of art and all the mysteries and wonders it holds for us to know and understand. With that, I give it over to Snigdha.
Thank you, Gavin. Moving on. With that very firm base in grade 6 and 7, eighth graders are very well equipped by this point to handle complex historical concepts of significance, causation, continuity, and so on. Now, let me show you a snapshot of what the teaching learning process looks like with focus on just one topic, the Industrial Revolution. In grade 8, in general, we also cover other revolutions, the French, the American, we talk about the Mughals. But let's just look at this topic to understand how it pans out in the classroom. Now, over the course of this topic, the Industrial Revolution, we focus on different areas. We focus on why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Britain and not anywhere else in the world? How did cities emerge at that time? What was it like living in a city? And also developments in classes. So, for the first time, monarchy was on its way out, and newer forms of governments were coming into the picture. The working class was on the rise. The nobility and the royals were not as revered as the previous centuries. So, now the idea is that while we are facilitating this topic, we must focus on different areas because it includes a widening of scope of a topic. So this topic is not just restricted to say scientific inventions such as the steam engine or the spinning jenny. We extend ideas to what's beyond. Okay, the idea that Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The idea that because of factories developing at the time and the development of industries of textile and wool, affected fashion and fashion as an industry. The fact that rise of factories also had an impact on job creation, on employment, and people who worked in those factories, they took home exploitative, compromised wages because labor was abundant in supply. Agriculture was going down, factory work was coming on the rise, and labor laws really weren't established very well by that time. Now, even within these topics, let's zoom in on one specific subtopic. Let's look at the rise of cities. Now, on this slide to the left, you see a short paragraph which describes a city. Pause a moment, look at the little things that are highlighted, such as narrow, houses are dirty, old, rundown, tumble down, utterly horrible, population strongly mixed with Irish blood. That includes a very vivid sort of a description. Now, this is an extract from a book titled Industrial Manchester by political theorist Frederick Engels. And of course, this text describes the city of Manchester during the peak of the Industrial Revolution, which would be the 1840s. Now, in class, reading and understanding this text as part of the discussion would push students to identify key ideas, which would be description of the city, migration, crowding, unplanned development, and so on. But more importantly, they are engaging with primary sources at this point. And in doing so, they are identifying significant concepts on their own. Then they are led to these key terminologies. The key terminologies are not given to them or offered to them. The purpose is to lead the child from the familiar to the unfamiliar. Okay, so the idea is to decode these context clues and then interpret historical sources by themselves. And in this process, students learn other things too, such as citations, that little box that you see to the left corner. Um, and citations also help them to select ideas for specific arguments from credible sources. And ultimately, a child would be able to present their own opinions after weighing evidence. Now, there are other forms of primary and secondary resources as well. Now, for example, to the left is a poem called The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake. Now, Blake, a formidable name in poetry, Blake enjoyed literary fame at the peak of the Industrial Revolution. And he was also one of its strongest critics. Now, this poem specifically talks about the life of a young child who was employed as a chimney sweeper during that time. Now, since chimneys were narrow and only a child would have a body small enough to go up the chimney to clean it, little children were employed during the industrial times for this specific purpose, and extremely harmful and extremely detrimental to the children's health because of the soot that would clog their lungs. The point is that for children who enjoy literature, this source would be an entry into the topic of child labor during the Victorian times. Now, to the right, you see an excerpt of first hand interviews of children who were factory workers back in the early 1800s. Now, this primary source to the right helps them understand perspectives and how one would be affected if they were part of such an exploitative system. So, overall, something to pique interest, and then something solid, fact information to back their knowledge on a particular topic. Now, not all materials that are brought to class are text based. You could have political cartoons, such as this one. This one depicts the harsh working conditions in factories, and also how day to day workers, factory workers, are bearing the brunt of their employers. Such primary sources train the students to look for contextual clues and to develop their skills of observation. It also helps them understand an alternate perspective, that is, why is the factory worker oppressed, and to understand their experiences. Looking at another example, what you see here is an ad for a coffee machine which uses steam power. Now, this product was extremely popular in the early 1800s London. Now, the idea is that when we talk about the invention of the steam engine, what do we have in mind? We have steam powered railway locomotives, these huge engines that could be used for transport, and they would speed up trade and the transport of goods. But the point is that the steam technology really percolated down to a lot of other common people. And so the application of steam in a very common coffee roaster, for that matter, is also significant, which is to show that sometimes whatever are the big changes, they also affect a lot of lives in small ways. Now, beyond handling and interpreting information, students are also encouraged to conduct their own research using credible sources and to also discern the quality of these sources. For example, in the last few years, we've done quite a lot of interesting projects. The image that you see is a brief overview of a project titled The Podcast Project, where students researched upon topics of their choice, topics that ranged from fashion during the 19th century to the impact of factory working conditions on mental health. Now, as you can see on your screen, these were two such topics. Students in groups made a podcast about music and the Industrial Revolution. Another group focused their podcast, they called it the Chocolate Chat, which focused on the chocolate industry that emerged during the industrial times. Now, such activities and projects, along with group work, class discussions, infographics, memory boards, these tools make classes interactive and learner driven. Overall, when you look at what do the students gain over this entire process, yes, of course, they can conduct class discussions. So they use all of this material, they analyze it, they develop vocabulary, they acquire historical terminology, they learn to look at multiple perspectives and opinions and communicate the same verbally. They can also write their answers, which is the most traditional form of teaching learning that we know. But even beyond that, they acquire more skills such as understanding that history is interdisciplinary, understanding that one historical event has an impact on different areas, including science, technology, psychology, economics, and in some way or the other, it will impact an individual life who's not even connected to that event, probably. And so, this idea of interdisciplinarity, the fact that it percolates into other subjects, is also an interest building factor. They also learn to use evidence based techniques to develop personal opinions and to arrive at their own conclusions. So, with that, I hope we've been able to offer a comprehensive insight into the teaching learning process of history at NIS. Our approach towards the subject lies very far from that pedantic tree of memory based knowledge. And fact dropping is not encouraged. Rather, students must know what to do with information they encounter every day. And arguably, this is a life skill. Ultimately, history is a skill based subject in its own way, which is geared at studying and understanding human behavior. And as they grow into their high school years of incessant questioning, they must not become passive consumers of information, but they should also evolve into critical thinkers. With that, I will be signing off. My name is Snigdha Roy. I'm the subject coordinator for history, and you can reach me on this email ID. You can also reach out to Mr. Gavin. He is our middle school facilitator for history, and this is his email ID. We hope that this webinar was informative and a few more are to follow soon. Thank you so much.